Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. And hi, Christine. We've already been talking, but hi again.
Hi, Heidi.
We'll pretend that we just met. So I told Christine that I read her book mostly in the bathtub, and she told me that this is actually something that has happened to a lot of people who read her book. So anyways, if there are other bathtub readers out there, you don't have to identify yourselves, but just so you know, you're not alone. So we thought I'd ask some questions. And since I realize the questions are a little serious and I want to make sure everybody actually gets a taste of how also very, very funny this book is, we thought maybe we'd break in the center and let Christine read for a little bit, and then we'll go back to questions from me and then questions from you. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, so Christine, this is a question for you. Okay, so also everybody, I have a migraine, so I'm not going to make a lot of sense, and that's just like that's just a conditional, just don't expect very much from me. I'm going to read from this piece of paper so that I don't say something I don't want to say. Okay, so the title you chose, The Life of the Mind, contains a paradox or a kind of built-in joke. Since this book tracks with graphic precision what happens to a narrator's body following a miscarriage, and it tracks and thinks about the blood dripping from her vagina, the amount, the color, the texture, and how all change over time. And I would really love to hear you talk about your earliest idea for this book, maybe even before you started to write it. Was this graphic portrayal of a miscarriage part of the initial impetus?
Okay, so I think first I just want to say thank you, Heidi, for doing this with me. It's a huge honor for me to have you here. And I guess if this were in person, I would like thank other people too. So I just want to do that really fast. I just want to thank my editor, Alexis, and my agent, Chris, and everyone at Hogarth and Gernert for just being such wonderful supporters of the book. So this, am I shouting also? I don't do a lot of, okay.
No.
So the story.
We can turn you down. We have the power to mute you, you understand.
Right, okay, great.
Go ahead, yell as much as you want.
So the story, the novel started as a short story, and the short story is more or less the first 10 or 12 pages of the novel. I mean, with some editing and revision and parts moved around. So originally I thought I was just writing this short story, and it kind of came out, everything was there about the miscarriage and the adjunct and the two therapists. But the story ended basically with her still in the bathroom in that first very opening pages of the book. And then it was a couple years later that I went back and decided to try to see if I could kind of keep that story going and find out what happened to her in the following weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of inversion of, well, I was thinking while I was reading it about The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, and how she uses as a clock for the book her pregnancy and her partner's surgery. And yeah, I just thought it was an interesting way to use the body as a clock.
Yeah, so that was when I decided that I was going to turn it into a novel. I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to have time work through the bleeding. Yeah. So I knew, and I mean, I was drawing on like, I knew that I wanted like every sort of, the days that I was going to be writing about, I wanted them to all be days that a certain kind of bleeding had happened. And so that was always in there as the structure. And that actually really helped me, I think, ground the book, I think, and it gave me like a very compressed time period, but also very specific days. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, so the bummer about you being a critic, or that you are a novelist who's also a critic, or that, yeah, you can't write the piece of criticism about your own book that I would love to read. So I am curious though, like how a critic such as yourself might contextualize this book in the current contemporary literary landscape, or even the distant literary landscape. Like, what other books or modes of thought is this book in conversation with? Like, I was just trying to think of other books that had such, I keep using the word graphic, and I wish I had a different word to use, but whatever, that word, that really look at bodily processes, in particular, sort of uterine processes, in such sort of objective detail. And yeah, so I was just wondering if there were other books you thought you were inspired by, or maybe inversely inspired by.
Yeah, that's such a good, hard question. I think that I didn't, I think it's hard because, of course, the book is in conversation with things. And of course, I've obviously been influenced by everything I've read, but I didn't, when I was working on the book, I wasn't like seeking out to read a lot of things that would be like it, if that makes sense. And so I a little bit put myself into like a black box. So I don't really know how to answer that question. I definitely know that there are other books that like care about embodiment the way my book does, but I sort of, I think one of the reasons the book might feel a little claustrophobic is because I did kind of block out a lot of other things. And I like that you use the word, I think use the word objective, because I do feel like the book isn't like reveling in the bleeding, I don't think, but it is sort of obsessed with it and just kind of picking it apart. Like at one point, the character kind of pulls apart one of these blood clots, and the book is kind of investigating like the texture of them, but it's not necessarily like celebrating them in a way that maybe another book would.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's that maybe it is the combination of the attention to detail, but it's a certain type of attention. It's an objective attention. And usually that attention is very, in a very stereotypical way, I suppose, very emotionally charged, you know? And so for you to sort of like break that connection, I thought was really, really interesting, and like something I couldn't really think of an antecedent, I suppose, which is why I hope that you had one.
Yeah, I know. I feel stupid for not having thought more about how to answer this, because I don't want to give the impression that I think that like no one's ever done this before. Obviously someone has. So if somebody wants to put something in the chat, I would love to hear what they would have to say.
That's right. Someone else can like write the syllabus for us right now.
Yeah.
Okay, this is sort of another just sort of thing I was thinking about. You know, another feature of this book that I think is really notable is that the narrator is I don't want to say she's a failed academic. She is a failing to thrive academic. Maybe that's the best way to put it. And however, it's clear that her peers think she's a failure, or she thinks her peers think she's a failure. And so there is a little bit of like, it just made me think a little bit of certain books, let's say recently by like some of Sam Lipsyte's more recent books, like the failed or loser kind of white male narrator. This is like a sort of regular star of literary fiction. And your narrator too kind of falls into the category of like privileged, loser, you know, failure, etc. And I was really curious about whether or not it seemed to you to matter, or if you could talk about whether it matters or is different because she is female.
You mean whether that nexus of privilege and precarity is different because she's female?
Yeah, or just like if you think about these, if someone were to be like, oh, you know, this is just like Sam Lipsyte's The Ask or something like that, you know what I mean? If there's a way, I guess what I'm saying is that there was a way that it felt like progress. I don't know. Like I was like, yay, a woman can be a loser too. I don't know. There was just I had a feeling of like and then I started to get myself into that twist of like, oh wow, in order to achieve progress, you have to have available to you the same degrees of lassitude, I suppose, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's progress when for a woman to be as like dysfunctional and as sort of yeah, I mean, I think because it's like, who is supposed to take care of other people? Like women are supposed to take care of other people. And then you're supposed to kind of hold it together as a woman, right? Because you're caring for yourself, but you're also caring for children or partners or family members or whatever. And then, so to have someone who's like really not kind of holding it together, I think is, yeah. Did you say progress?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I was really hesitant to say that because it felt like progress to me, but whenever something feels like progress, I have to like stop and ask myself like, yeah, what I'm bringing to that judgment or that assessment. But there did feel like, I guess if you're talking about a nexus, like the fact that yeah, like a woman, it seemed to me, um yeah, letting it all go like that. It felt, yeah, it's hard to call it progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's just that it's different. I mean, we're certainly living in a kind of golden age of publishing books by and about women, I think, like whether it's republishing things from the past that were overlooked, or like, like the Emily books that were dedicated to that, or like other presses like Dorothy or whatever that specialize. So I think we're definitely, there's tons more stories about women in the last 10 or 15 years than we had before. But um, I think I do think the character in the book maybe is a kind of character that hasn't been seen before. I mean, there aren't a lot of stories by and about female intellectuals. Like, I think the female intellectual is kind of a problematic figure for a lot of people. I mean, even the word cerebral, which keeps getting attached to my book as it's being talked about, like there's something about that word that I always just wonder what that word means to people, because it a little bit sounds like you have a problem with that. You know what I mean? Nobody's like, oh, it's just so great how cerebral that person is. Like, so maybe that's part of what might feel new or different. I feel like I'm not the person who's even supposed to be saying what's new or different about it.
No, but I mean, I guess I'm saying that something felt something about her situation felt really liberating to me to read about. Like it felt very it felt like she was sort of like hoeing a sort of radical path by refusing to do what she was supposed to do, even though she maybe is unable to do it. It's unclear. Like, and I think that's part of what is interesting about her as a character, is just like, is she a failure or does she not care? Or, I like her refusal to just kind of succeed for the sake of succeeding in a weird way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reader, I think, has the sense about her that she kind of like knows what she would have to do to be more like her rival. She has this rival, Alexandra, from her graduate program, who's become like a very successful academic. I mean, the rivalry is all in Dorothy's head, right? I don't, it's not like Alexandra is aware to the extent to which she figures in Dorothy's imagination. But yeah, I do have a sense that she kind of knows what she would have to do, but yet is really unable to do it.
Yeah. Okay, so since we're now talking about her as an academic, I did want to ask about academics and power dynamics. And obviously, like, so much is changing in so many professional cultures, to the degree that any of these things are really top to bottom, I can't say, but at least there's pressure for change. And so like chefs, for example, can no longer verbally abuse their kitchen staff. And likewise in academia, it's been called out for its academic star system, which leads to power abuse of graduate students because they need to suck up to these, glamorous megalomaniacs in order to get jobs and et cetera. So, but it seemed like your book is positioned at the beginning of the end of this dynamic or this system. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that change, if you think it's actually happening and what might take its place.
Oh, wow, that's such a hard question. Well, if it's changing because of the increasing adjunctification of the academy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily changing for the better. This is kind of hard for me to say though, because I haven't really been, I finished my PhD in 2014, and I haven't really been very immersed in academia since then. So I'm not sure that I am the right person to kind of like weigh in on what might be happening. What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I really am so curious about it. I see a lot of growing pains, honestly. I see people who joined this, who signed up for this career trajectory because, you wanted to become a star, and then you would have the power, you could sweep around in your robes, you know what I mean? And now suddenly, like, that's not necessarily available to people anymore. And so it's sort of calling into question. I mean, I think it's like that awkward in between moment where it's sort of like the reward system is like changing as we speak, but nobody knows now who's giving the rewards, and nor what the rewards are or how you get them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And which is exciting, obviously, because it is yeah, I mean, I think it really makes you realize that hierarchies are just really convenient. They just make things very clear, you know? And the minute those are gone, then suddenly there's like a lot of confusion. And I think a lot of times people are just like, I'll just take clarity, you know,
Yeah.
over,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm wondering too, if you were thinking at all about like campus novels when you were writing this at all, because it also feels like kind of the anti-campus novel to me.
Well,
Because
because there's no campus,
yeah,
right?
there's no campus. Yeah, anyway, so yeah, I'm curious what you thought about that as a category of book, and one that you are both in and not in.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I thought of it, as that I would probably be talked about in that way, just because the character was, you know, an adjunct in an English department, but that it really isn't like that, because she's not tied to the institution. She's not attending faculty meetings. She's not being drafted to go on committees. You never really see her interacting with any other member of the department that she's currently in. A lot of her imaginary is about people from the past, right? And like where they wound up in these more successful places. And, you know, she's very like ghostly in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it also seemed like it was everything just already felt so decentered, you know, and it's like that the moment when she can't even find a printer to print at, and the librarians are like,
Yeah.
well, send it to a different printer, just send it to a different printer,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, those kind of like humiliations of not like, she doesn't really have a home in the university, although she's there all the time teaching, and like she has nowhere to go, and it's before her class is going to start, right? So she's like, do I sit on this bench? Do I go to the bathroom? Like, I don't have an office. Like, where am I supposed to be?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about one of the funnier parts, and then maybe you should read this very funny part that we talked about. So among the funnier parts is in the book is the two therapists feature. So the narrator is going to two therapists, and I have to say that I think it's sort of played for fun, and that I know that it's supposed to maybe show that she's excessively self-involved, even though she knows that about herself. I actually also sort of wondered if there wasn't something very wise about this strategy. Like, it's like going to, I mean, it's like you would go to a medical doctor for a second opinion. Like, she's going to this other therapist for a second opinion. Anyways, I just thought I'd be curious to know about this two therapy situation, and talk a little bit about that, since that was obviously also part of the first original story.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was funny, obviously. I mean, I liked that she's a cheater, right? But she's not cheating on her romantic partner. She's cheating on her therapist with a different therapist. So there's a sort of like joke about her faithlessness, I think, but it comes out in this odd way. I think that I also see her as someone who really is like seeking care and then refusing care, right? So like she's in a little bit of a game with people, but also she really is trying to get help but doesn't know how. And so like the second therapist, she's like, well, maybe this person can help me, and like she won't really let herself be helped. Someone was telling me that someone who I know who is in kind of like substance abuse circles, recovery circles, said that it's actually kind of common for addicts to have multiple therapists, because you're kind of like going to one person but not really addressing the problem, and then you go to somebody else and you lie there. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, I just learned that the other day. But I think the book is also like, there's a lot of doubling in the book, and that was something that I built in from the beginning. So there's too many therapists, there's too many daughters. Dorothy's mother has a kind of surrogate daughter. There is a sort of story that's inserted about twins. There's just this kind of Dorothy's whole world is kind of like doubled in this way. And the point of that for me was that is just to sort of emphasize her contingency. And like, she has a real feeling that she's sort of going through her life, but she's not really there. And it's kind of like, is this therapist or that therapist, like this person or that person?
Yeah, that's actually, it's funny because I was trying to think like, what would be the syllabus that this book would be like a perfect member of? And I guess like yeah, books about like doubling and twinning and whatever. That also feels like uh yeah, it feels like there's a lot of comparison that goes on in the book too, where sort of she's always comparing herself to other people. And interestingly, like sort of comes up short maybe, but she doesn't always use it as a way to feel badly about herself. At the same time, I thought there was some really interesting stuff that you talked about in terms of like envy and ambition. And also shame. I feel like shame came up a couple of times too. Wondering if like envy, ambition, shame, those three words go.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think for me, the book is about shame. Like if I were going to write about it, that's what I would say that it's about. And it's about, and because it's about withholding, it's about, I mean, as the writer, I definitely like wanted to write about things that were potentially shaming or humiliating or embarrassing to me, right? And so like I think that that's just built into the book, and it's like part of the book's architecture, you know, a kind of like dragging things into public view that are usually kind of kept hidden.
Yeah. And is that a way, would you say then, I mean, again, like just to get back to this objective description of bleeding and using it as a clock, and also seeing this as a book about dragging stuff into the light that isn't usually that usually is not. Did you see this book as being something that like, so now this is no longer an occasion for shame, like you bring it in and now you're not ashamed of it anymore?
Well, I just think you kind of survive it, you know, like I don't know if you're not ashamed of it anymore, but it just like it doesn't kill you, you know, and then so you're like, well, I'm still here, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, I did that. I wrote a book where someone is like taking a shit and then like picking apart a blood clot, and we're all still here. Like that's cool, you know. It's kind of like, I guess it's kind of liberating to be on the other side of that.
Yeah. Okay, so in 8 minutes we have to take questions.
Okay.
Do you want to do a reading or a partial reading or a full reading of that?
Yeah. Let's
do it because it's really funny.
Okay, it's funny. So I'll start a little bit into it. Okay, so I'm going to read from the section where Dorothy is first arriving in Las Vegas at an academic conference. So at the beginning of this section, she's in the hotel bathroom, and she is dealing with this lump, this resiny lump, and then she kind of flashes back and is remembering the trip to Las Vegas. And I'm going to start when she's in the middle of the airplane. Actually, I'm going to start when she's in the taxi.
Okay.
The taxi ride from the airport was confusing. Dorothy did not feel capable of processing the landmarks. It was her first time in Las Vegas. She hugged her bag and kept saying to herself, I'm in Las Vegas, as if that would help. After depositing her luggage in a small, dim room in the upper heavens of Harrah's, she went for a walk on the strip. The number of young children was a surprise. Everyone was drinking through twisty straws, all ages. It was like Disney World, except there were no animals and no rides. And when you thought about the mass transfer of capital from individual social security accounts into casino coffers, you wanted to stab yourself with a twisty straw. The crowd meandered, stopping frequently to gawk or take photographs of signs or themselves. But Dorothy, trained to walk purposefully on New York streets, moved with precision, finding the undefended pockets of space as skillfully as any professional athlete. It was 92 degrees and the sweat pooled behind her knees and gathered at her brow. The back of her neck under her hair was sweaty. The casinos were so big that there was no one place to stand that offered a satisfactory experience of seeing them in their totality. Being across the street helped, but only a little. They had impressive architectural entryways, large mouths that wanted to swallow you, and you let them do it because it was cool inside. She crossed the street to be closer to the jumping fountains outside the Bellagio. Presumably the water was recycled and recirculated, but it still seemed, in its ostentation, a gross celebration from simpler, happier times. The fountain said, "Don't worry about resources." It said there was enough for everyone and more for the show. That was all it said. She liked watching it. She made it as far as Paris before turning back, panting and thirsty, for the opening reception of the conference, where conversation revolved around the conference organizers' choice of first Vegas and second Harrah's. On the edge of the group, she saw Keith, an acquaintance, friend, ex from grad school, who had gone on to a tenure-track job at Johns Hopkins. Keith was more handsome than she remembered, grayer and leaner, like he had taken up a fitness regime. He wore red threads around his wrists. He was glad to see her. His eyes latched onto Dorothy's with barbed hooks. His hand grabbed her hand, his mouth kissed her cheek. Dorothy tried to remember when she had agreed that any man who felt like it was permitted to put his open mouth on her face. It didn't make her angry that men did this. She just wanted to know when she had signed off on it. She used to think a lot about how different her life would be if she had wound up with Keith. In an idle way, not as a real counterfactual. It would never have worked out. It didn't work out. Keith was rich, which Dorothy had liked, but stingy, which she didn't. He always wanted to split the bill. Their thing lasted only a couple months. It might have gone on forever, except one weekend he brought her to his little cabin in the country, where instead of having sex and letting her fall asleep with her face in his armpit, which smelled amazing, he announced that he wanted to try something. This something turned out to be whispering into her vagina for almost an hour while she shivered beneath a thin flannel blanket and occasionally remembered to pet his head. Poems by Frank O'Hara. He whispered poems by Frank O'Hara into her vagina. He did stuff with his tongue too, but it was all timed to the poems, and Dorothy lay there under the single Edison bulb with its lightning rod of golden filament crackling, wondering how, when, where he got the idea that this was a good idea. Was she the guinea pig? Or was this tried and true? Had this been somebody's favorite thing? He wasn't talking to her vagina. It wasn't like he had original content he needed to communicate to it. It wasn't like she, Dorothy, was being addressed. She had been confused for somebody else, the kind of person who could orgasm over a poem. Or was the idea that you could say anything into any vagina and the vibrations of air would have their effect? In that case, why poems? Dorothy didn't even like poems. How had Keith gotten the idea that she did? Did she seem like a poem person? What was wrong with how she was presenting herself to the world that this kind of misrecognition was even possible? "I thought you loved language," was what he said when he finally gave up. A good sport, he reached down with his hand, but Dorothy pushed him away as politely as she could. "Wow," was what she said. What she most remembered about this unpleasant night was Keith's face, which he periodically withdrew to assess his progress and announce each subsequent title, like he was giving a reading, like he had written these poems himself. It was so eager and proud, like a dog's face after it brings some disgusting prize to its owner. Remembering it now, Dorothy recoiled with shame. What was wrong with the way they had done things before? That was what Dorothy still could not understand. Life was hard enough without taking easy victories away. But Keith, it seemed, had been bored by her, or he hated her, or most disturbingly, their ideas of pleasure were so different that his way of expressing affection was perceived by Dorothy as an affront bordering on an offense. The next week she met Raj, and a couple of weeks after that, Keith got together with a pint-sized art historian. And when they saw each other in seminar, he acted like everything was totally normal. They were just two overeducated chimpanzees who used to take off their pants and whisper into each other's genitals in Connecticut, and now were content comparing notes in Franco Moretti. What she had shared and done with Keith, even if she hadn't done it herself, she had been there. She was implicated. Was, Dorothy knew, more intimate than anything she had ever done or shared with Raj. But intimacy wasn't in itself a good thing. There was such a thing as privacy. Raj would never impinge on her the way Keith had, would never expose her. Through disinterest or tenderness, he permitted her to remain intact, a little hidden from him. He always showed her exquisite courtesy.
Amazing. Okay, so I'll ask one more question and then I will open it up. Was Frank O'Hara the first choice, or were there other poets that you considered?
It was always Frank O'Hara. There was never anybody else.
Why only Frank O'Hara? No.
It just seemed like something that guy would do. You know, like I have nothing against Frank O'Hara. I like Frank O'Hara. I mean, I'm not like a Frank O'Hara expert, but you know, I've read a few Frank O'Hara poems and I like them. They just seemed like somebody would find that sexy and would like want to whisper that into your body.
Yes, amazing. Okay, thank you for reading that, and I hope that gives everybody a sense of how, I mean, obviously, to say that that is a funny scene is to very much flatten all the things that are happening in that scene, including just the fact that like he is putting words into her vagina, you know, and thinking that she'll think it's sexy. It's anyways, thank you for reading that.
You know what's funny is that this a book, another novel, that novel Mona that just came out,
Oh yeah,
also has somebody reciting poems into somebody's vagina,
really?
but it's like sexy in that book.
Oh, interesting.
So I hope that somebody out there in the world will write about these two books together, because I actually feel like these, like, what are the odds that two books that come out like a month apart from each other both feature this bizarre.
Well, so now I would like someone to put into the chat if they know of any other books where there is talking into vaginas.
Because that is the syllabus that my book.
That's the syllabus. Yeah, definitely. That is the syllabus.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I have a question here. So I'm going to go to the questions. Let's see. What do you think of the relationship between both personal and literary narrative and apocalyptic climate change consistently backgrounded in this book? Or is it no different from how our mortality throughout the ages has informed narrative? I guess what hooked me in this book is the constant move around what's real, surreal, unreal, and what could be articulated but remains somehow inarticulate, inclusive of who Dorothy is relative to herself. I haven't finished the book yet, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Thanks for the honesty, Michelle.
Thanks for reading. I really like, thank you to everyone who is reading or has read or will read the book. So I think the question is asking like how narrative structure is informed by apocalyptic climate change. Michelle, is that kind of what you're asking? I mean, I definitely think the book is both thematizing that and also trying to actually enact it formally. You know, like the book does not have, does not build to like a climactic revelation. Like, I don't want to give too much away, but like there is a kind of doubling in the plot also. There's a kind of like the miscarriage is paired structurally with another kind of reproductive event. And that kind of substitutes for like a thing happening in the book, right? There's not necessarily like a very satisfying, big show-stopping ending. So the point of I think one of the points of the book is that climate crisis is not going to look apocalyptic in the way of like a nuclear war, right? In the way that we just imagine a catastrophe now in the 21st century is very different and has to be very different than how we used to imagine it in the 20th century.
Yeah.
That like the end is here. It already happened. It hasn't happened yet. It's about to happen. It's always already happening. It's happening all the time. It's happening for some people, but not for us but not for others, and so forth.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. I will ask a question while, oh, here we go. The sense I get is of Charlotte Roche's Wetlands transplanted into academia in New York, but your reading opens up an interesting vein of dissected dysphoria.
I don't know Charlotte Roche's Wetlands. What do I need to know about that?
I don't know, but I'm writing it down. That's what's great about these things. You get a whole reading list.
Awesome.
Another question I was going to ask, and this is maybe quite boring for you to contemplate, but I actually care about the answer, so I'm going to ask it. How do you see or how do you experience writing as a critic and a fiction writer, and how do these two, do you experience them as different modes? How do they interact? How do they reinforce or challenge or negate or hinder one another?
I think when it's not the writing in the two modes that's hard, it's the like being the two people that's hard. You know, I think that the world, like if you have at all established yourself in any way as a sort of nonfiction writer, truly the last thing people want to hear is that you've decided to take a stab at writing fiction. Like people are like, why? I'm embarrassed for you. This whole conversation is embarrassing. Please don't do that, is like definitely a vibe.
But why? Why is that?
Well, I think because it's sort of like, I don't know, I think there's something really embarrassing about it's also, you know, later in life, if you decide to try something that you haven't been known for doing before, I think it's, I don't know, maybe that's just, maybe I'm projecting onto other people. Anyway, I think that is the challenge. It's not like, oh, I'm sitting down to the computer and I hear like the critic in my head. It's more like, just even talking about the novel with people when I was working on it was so painful that I often would just never bring it up.
I wonder if there isn't something, and I feel like this was really, really old fashioned of me and I got over it, but there was a point in my life where I really wanted there to just be a critic who was just a critic. And that somehow when I learned that that critic then had written a novel, I was like, oh, you mean all this time you just really wanted to be a novel? Like there was a way that, and I'm not saying that about you at all. Because I do this too. I go between these selves as well. I had this notion of like, oh, there's like the person who is so has so little ego involved in the creation of fiction, therefore they will be more objective assessors of it.
Yeah, I mean, in my defense, I will say that I wasn't like harboring a secret, like, I think I should be a fiction writer of fantasies like the whole 40 years. You know, it was just like, I definitely, like, I had this moment.
You go ahead and tell yourself that.
Like, I'm sure I'm repressing it, but like, I had a moment where I was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna try to write fiction. But like, it was late. I was like in my 30s already, you know, and so I felt like fully formed as a person who wrote about books before wanting to write, you know, any fiction and then this book. But I know what you mean, that you kind of just want someone to like do the one thing.
I mean, it's a really, I now am embarrassed, honestly, that that was ever something that I felt. I don't know why. I felt there would be some sort of objectivity achieved by somebody who didn't want to write a novel, but that's also just complete fiction in and of itself, you know? I wonder too if there isn't something where, I mean, this is now again, seems like such an outdated kind of like weird, guarding a boundary that doesn't really exist anymore, but like the boundaries are so, people traipse back and forth across them so frequently now that it doesn't seem that you need to have like planted your flag and like, I'm a fiction writer, I'm a nonfiction writer. But maybe some people are just like, wait, you can't do that too. Like I spent my whole life wanting to do that. You can't just decide at 35 or whatever.
Yeah, that might be true. Wait, my friend Elena has asked a
Oh yeah.
question. Can we answer?
Yeah. What are the pleasures you discovered in writing fiction once you started?
Hi, Elena. Thanks for coming. Just more, I think more freedom, you know, like honestly, just more like, you know, you can do really like anything, you know, whatever, going anywhere, not having to be tied to the text that or the object that you're writing the criticism about. You can be weirder. And I do think that, like, you know, I've written for magazines for a long time and I really like writing for magazines. But the scary and exciting thing about writing this book was that there was no one who was trying to tell me how it was supposed to be. You know, like when you write for a certain magazine, you have to write that kind of piece, right? You're not really just like free to do whatever. I mean, maybe a few writers are free to do whatever, but I'm not one of them. And so like this was just like, oh, I could do anything. Yeah.
Okay, here's a great question. What was your dissertation on?
Oh my God, it's a nightmare. It's like, I was thinking the other day about like what a crazy thing the mind is and how I had put myself in this position where now I'm going to have to answer this question, like what's my dissertation on, after totally like leaving academia because I never wanted to think about my dissertation again.
You're not going to tell us? You have to tell us.
It was called Depressive Realism, and it was about, I had 4 writers. It was Thackeray, Trollope, Charlotte Bronte, and Thomas Hardy.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Another one of the parts of your book that I enjoyed so much, and which I realized it's so hard to satirize academia. For example, the narrator's paper that she's delivering is about is it Christminster
The
cookies? Is that-
Christminster, yeah, and Jude the Obscure, there's this one part where they bake these little cookies in the shape of Christminster.
And so then she's also writing about the Eucharist and baking and 19th century discourses on the digestive tract and cholera outbreaks. Like, I mean, I guess that's not
Typical conference paper, yeah.
yeah, exactly. I guess what I also found so again, like all the ways that this book, when you talk about shame, I think there was all kinds of shame that was I mean, not necessarily body shame, but like also intellectual shame.
Mhm.
So like I felt a little bit of intellectual shame when I was like, I know I'm supposed to find these papers really ridiculous, but like I totally want to go to that panel.
Oh yeah, I mean, just to be clear, like I don't think that paper sounds ridiculous.
Not at all. I was actually really excited to hear that paper.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just sounds like the paper, you know, and it's like, I think the book is a little bit of a Rorschach test. It's like, you know, I mean, everything is, but I don't know, do you think that that's like stupid, or do you think that that sounds like a good paper that's going to say more about you than about the book?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, it's 7:50.
Okay.
Are we supposed to stop now?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Heidi and Christine, thank you so much. This was an illuminating discussion. I could listen to you, Christine, maybe talk about a little more about the fake dissertation in your novel and how real that sounded to me. Um, but this has been really wonderful. Please, everyone, buy a copy of The Life of the Mind. It doesn't even have to be from McNally Jackson. Just read it. You'll be so happy if you read it. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.